A long-discussed idea of a new oil pipeline to Canada's west coast appears to be gaining momentum. Prime Minister Mark Carney and Alberta Premier Danielle Smith have unveiled plans for a proposed pipeline that would carry more than 1 million barrels of oil a day from Alberta to the BC coast. The announcement comes alongside a new agreement between Ottawa and British Columbia, aimed at clearing the way for major resource and infrastructure projects. Our Mackenzie Gray joins us now to break it all down for us. So, Mac, this is being pitched as a nation-building project. Walk us through what exactly was announced.
It was two separate announcements yesterday. David Eby, the BC Premier, and Mark Carney met in Vancouver earlier in the day. But the really big announcement came much later in the day, late in the evening here in Ottawa time, between Danielle Smith, the Alberta Premier, and Mark Carney, where they announced that the Trans Mountain Corporation, the same people that built the Trans Mountain pipeline, are going to be building a new pipeline, or at least that's the proposal in this situation, to go from Alberta to Point Roberts, British Columbia. That's where one of the terminals is there, and Delta. So a bit of a different route at the end, not going to Burnaby, but going to a little bit different spot close to Vancouver there. But the plan is for the new pipeline to follow basically the same route that the existing TMX pipeline has. Of course, that's different than what the original MOU between Alberta and Ottawa said. They said they wanted a pipeline to the northwest coast of British Columbia. That was going to be much more challenging, certainly from a political perspective. That is an area where, of course, the North Coast tanker ban is in place in British Columbia, as well. There would be significant First Nations opposition in this situation. Danielle Smith, when she was asked about that yesterday, said it's much cheaper and easier for a new pipeline to be built going south. And of course, when we talk about that BC deal that was struck between Eby and Carney, there's $10 billion that the federal government's going to put up to make major improvements to the Port Roberts port down in Tsawwassen Delta, British Columbia there. So a very big change of pace, though, from the Prime Minister, who promised when that first MOU was signed that if there was no private proponent, there was not going to be a pipeline. Well, the same organization that built TMX is going to build this. There is a private company that is involved, Pembina. They are going to have at a minimum 10% ownership stake. It could move up to 20% according to a press release that the company put out. But they went to great lengths to say that they're not building a pipeline, that it's the federal government that is going to be building this pipeline. They're going to be kind of a consultant helping out. The details on the situation about that is a little bit iffy. In terms of when this could be starting to be built, 2027 is the earliest. The Alberta government has said that this could be underway. The cost, a minimum of $35 billion. It could go up into the mid-40s. We should point out that it was around $8 billion. That was the guesstimate when the Trans Mountain pipeline was bought by Justin Trudeau. The twinning happened in that situation. It ended up being over $30 billion. So these things have a tendency to run well over budget. It's still not a done deal. There's many other opportunities need to be forward, but the fact that the federal government and the Alberta government are partnering in this situation, that a Crown corporation is building this, that they're building it on an existing route, certainly points to all signs going forward that this pipeline is very likely to become a reality.
Now, Mac, BC Premier David Eby says the province will not challenge a potential pipeline proposal in court. I mean, how significant is that commitment given the history of pipeline battles in Western Canada?
Mr. Eby, from the beginning of this, has recognized that the court challenges that the previous BC NDP government did when TMX was getting built led to a decision from the Supreme Court that said the federal government has the right to permit these trans-provincial pipelines, and that basically the provinces don't have a lot of say in it. So David Eby's hands were certainly tied in that situation. If the federal government wanted to build a pipeline to the northwest coast of British Columbia, the objections of First Nations were going to be much bigger issues than the province. Of course, if you're Mark Carney and you talk a lot about cooperative federalism, you want BC on side, and that's why we saw that agreement yesterday. There's more than just this $10 billion that's going to be done to build up the port in Delta. There's a couple $1 billion to help with the George Massey Tunnel, which is an important kind of gridlock issue that's being dealt with in Vancouver. There's additional permitting that the federal government's promising to speed up with a number of LNG projects. And when you're kind of thinking about this, I think there's a pretty clear split. In the northwest coast of BC, it's going to be LNG that moves up there. In the south around Vancouver, it's going to be oil that moves down there. That's kind of the split that's going on at this point in time, with a number of major LNG projects that have been approved or are awaiting final investment decisions up in the north coast of British Columbia. So Eby went to great lengths yesterday talking about how, look, the Prime Minister didn't need to do these things. The federal government had the ability to push this pipeline forward. If you're Mark Carney, I think you're trying to kind of buy some peace, both in BC and Alberta. Of course, there's the referendum that's coming up in Alberta. This is what we hear from Danielle Smith consistently saying, look, it's better to be in Canada because we can actually get major things built under Mr. Carney, compared to the feeling that a lot of Conservatives had, including Ms. Smith, that things like this would have not been possible under Mr. Trudeau, despite the fact that Mr. Trudeau bought the TMX pipeline, twinned it, and now has a Crown corporation that is going to be building, potentially, this new pipeline going forward.
Now, of course, there's still a long way, Mac, between a proposal and a pipeline in the ground. What are the key hurdles that could determine whether this project actually moves forward?
Well, of course, you're going to have consultations with First Nations. I would say in this situation, since the plan is to largely use the existing route, you would imagine that they're either on side or already have frameworks in place that you can be able to work with those First Nations going forward. Having the province on board is helpful, not necessarily from a core perspective, because we know the federal government has the ability to push these things through, but when you've got a willing participant who can help with things like hydro, roads, other things for the construction process, that will certainly be helpful in those situations too. I'd be interested to see, once we dig more into things, about what the capacity is at the port to be able to move these things forward. One thing we've heard from the BC government, I should say from the Alberta government, is VLCC. These are the very large crude tankers that can take more oil. There have been some issues with the current TMX pipeline that is in Burnaby about the amount of oil that can go onto those tankers, the size of the tankers in those situations. We'll have to see how that plays out and how long these things take. We also saw huge delays with the last pipeline, major cost overruns. I'm interested to see what the cost and the final estimates are going to be in this situation. Another thing that needs to happen, and we heard from Danielle Smith yesterday saying that there's no signed deals, is that countries need to buy this oil, or companies need to buy this oil. The goal, of course, is to have this oil largely go to Asia, to shrink the differential between what American oil gets and what Canadian oil gets. Also, of course, to diversify trade markets, which is something we hear constantly from the Prime Minister. You're going to need to have orders from those countries. We've seen Mark Carney spend a lot of time in Asia. Are those countries willing to step up and buy Canadian oil? I think that's likely, but you've got to get those deals signed. So lots of work ahead, but the fact that the Alberta and provincial governments and federal government are going to be partners either in the 80 to 90% range of owning this pipeline based on what we know at this point in time is a pretty strong signal that this pipeline is very likely to go forward.
All right, that is our Mackenzie Gray joining us from Ottawa. Thank you for the breakdown, Mac.